If you have ever seen a fantasy film or played a fantasy game of any kind, I'm sure you have encountered all sorts of creatures that can talk. Orcs, monsters, dragons, great eagles, even what in our eyes looks like talking trees. As part of a fantasy setting, we of course accept this, that this is possible in this world. But have you ever wondered why these creatures can talk? I'm not really asking how, but rather, why does the author of this tale want these creatures to communicate? Is there a deeper meaning behind it all? And what might that be? It's actually something mentioned briefly by Tolkien in his essay on fairy stories. So let's dive into it and then see how it applies to his own world of Middle-earth. According to Tolkien, we have in us a deep desire to communicate with other creatures, creatures that may or may not be like us. Beasts and birds and other creatures often talk like men in real fairy stories. In some part, often small, this marvel derives from one of the primal desires that lie near the heart of fairy, the desire of men to hold communion with other living things. I think Tolkien is onto something here. It is not only in fairy stories that other creatures are given speech to communicate with mankind. It is found in many myths, and even in modern sci-fi films. Here mankind often encounter aliens and ask the question, what would happen if we encountered other creatures? In some cases they are like us, but in most they seem superior to us, either in strength or intelligence, if not both. One could also look into the origin story of mankind, found in the Bible, and even discuss how the snake can speak, and if we have always within us desire to speak with the other. But I think that's a topic for another day. Instead, I think we should take a look at the creatures given speech in Tolkien's stories. So let's start by looking at The Hobbit. The Hobbit is often one of the first books fans of Tolkien will read, unless they jump right into The Lord of the Rings. While the stories are connected, The Hobbit has a different feel to it. I think one of the reasons is the sheer amount of other creatures encountered. Most of them are actually able to speak, though you might not know this if you've only watched the films. The first enemy on the journey to the Lonely Mountain are the three stone trolls, Tom, Bert and William. They are different to the trolls we meet in The Lord of the Rings. These ones actually talk, and it's actually a big part of their character. One could even argue it's their ability to speak that ultimately gets them turned into stone. The trolls argue for so long that the sun rises, and they are thus turned into stone. I think it's just one example, but it's still interesting as monsters in many stories are often unable to speak, to make them seem less like humans. It's also fair to mention that Bilbo, a hobbit, can speak, and the same goes for dwarves, elves, and wizards, none of which are technically human, yet they obviously resemble very human qualities and flaws. It is interesting though that orcs, or goblins as they are called in The Hobbit, can speak. Not only can they speak the common tongue, but they also have their very own language, Orcish. It's one of the languages in Middle-earth we know very little of. Regardless, it's interesting that even the enemy of the story is given a voice and are able to communicate. While they are monsters, they aren't simply mindless creatures without a language or culture. An interesting side note from The Hobbit that is often overlooked is that even wargs had a language of their own. And more interestingly, the orcs can communicate with them, and for some unknown reason, even Gandalf understands them. At least if we are to believe what Bilbo wrote in the Red Book. This idea of animals being able to speak with other creatures is actually quite prevalent in The Hobbit. The most obvious example is the great eagles that rescue the company and then later flies them to the Karok. As we know, Gandalf has befriended them and can also speak with other birds. In fact, he has a closer bond to them than Radagast, another wizard famous for communicating with animals. This of course leads us to an interesting character of the story, Beorn. He is a skin changer, a man who could assume the form of a huge black bear, a werebear, one could say. He is very much inspired by Bodvar Bjarki from the saga of Rolf Kraki, a story that takes place in Denmark, right next to where I grew up, if legends be true of course. Beorn is an interesting character that also ends up killing the main antagonist of the story, Bolg, during the Battle of the Five Armies. Despite his importance, He is not part of the Lord of the Rings. At that point, it's his son Grimbeon that rules the lands around the Carrock. He's more of a side note character though. Animals do also play a key role in The Hobbit in regards to Smaug. It is a thrush that overhears Bilbo telling the dwarves about Smaug's weak spot, then flies to the bowman Bard and tells him about it. If it had not been for the thrush, Smaug would likely not have been slain. I find that really interesting and quite different from The Lord of the Rings, where no animals are given such important roles, even though Bill is a huge fan favorite. There's of course also the ravens of Erebor that fly to the Iron Hills and sends news to Dane Ironfoot, so even the ravens play a major role in the story. The conversation between Bilbo and Smaug is also an iconic and important aspect of the story. Dragons are highly intelligent, so it makes sense they can speak. I think this makes The Hobbit stand out a bit, as dragons in many other stories are unable to speak. Smaug is, as some of you know, influenced by the dragon in the poem of Beowulf, which doesn't actually speak. But Smaug is also based on Fafnir, the dragon slain by the famous warrior Sigurd. Fafnir, on the other hand, does actually speak, both in the Poetic Edda and the Volsunga Saga. Here it's clear that Tolkien took some inspiration, as the dragon asks who Sigurd is, to some extent like Smaug questions Bilbo. So to sum it up, there are an incredible amount of creatures that can speak in The Hobbit. Surely the same can be said about The Lord of the Rings, but not to the same extent, despite being so much longer. Of course we have the great eagles again, then we could mention the Nazgul, Oathbreakers and Barrow-wights, all creatures that are not exactly alive in the normal sense. But what I want to highlight is that in The Hobbit, Bilbo encounters many spiders in Mirkwood that are able to speak. All of these are the breeds of Shelob, yet she seems voiceless in The Lord of the Rings. We do know that she was somehow able to communicate with Gollum, but it's not clear if she could actually speak or not. Sure, we could argue that she must have been able to speak, just like her breeds and her mother Ungoliant. But the point is that she is given no words in The Lord of the Rings. I think this makes her seem even more evil and twisted by the darkness. This idea of being twisted by the dark is obviously also seen with a character like Gollum, that originally is a hobbit, yet he now seems like a darker version of himself. The two sides in Gollum don't exactly seem to always agree. I'm sure many of you can't help but think of Andy Serkis' iconic depiction of him. Another side note is this idea of evil being voiceless is also seen with Sauron, that always seems to be lurking in the dark, yet he has no dialogue in the story. He is present, without saying a word, or being actually seen. Yet his evil reaches far and wide, and the actions of his servants speak for him, in a way. I guess the most interesting new creature in The Lord of the Rings that can speak are the Ents. We mostly get to know Treebeard, of course, but there are other Ents we meet, like Quickbeam, that seems to have just as much personality. I think the Ent symbolizes something deep within Tolkien. It's no secret he had a deep love for trees, which is why they're described with such details in his works. But I can't help get a feeling that Tolkien would have loved to communicate with one. Imagine for how long they have been standing there, what stories they could tell, and what would they do and say about the modern world if they could. I think the Ents in The Lord of the Rings gives us an idea about that question, especially when they turn on Saruman. I think their attack on Isengard is the best way to picture it. Tolkien himself mentions that perhaps one of the inspirations for the Ents was born from his own frustration with Shakespeare's Macbeth. The part in the story is due, I think, to my bitter disappointment and disgust from school days with the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of Great Birnam Wood to High Dunsinane Hill. While Tolkien doesn't seem to be a fan of Shakespeare, he does actually take a lot of elements from Shakespeare's plays and uses for his own works, but we will cover that in detail some other day. In both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's decision to give speech to certain creatures isn't just a narrative tool, it's a profound expression of his belief in the interconnectedness of all things and the importance of communication. By allowing trolls, dragons, spiders, eagles, and even trees to talk, Tolkien invites us to see these beings as more than just obstacles or allies. They become reflections of humanity's relationship with the other, embodying traits like greed, wisdom, malice, or courage. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories reminds us of our primal desire to connect with other creatures, to step outside ourselves and imagine what it might be like to have a conversation with beings utterly different from us. Whether it's Smaug's cunning dialogue, the End's slow wisdom, or even Gollum's fractured self-communication, each voice in Tolkien's works brings something vital to the story. These creatures don't just speak, they reveal truth about the world, about humanity, and about the values Tolkien held dear, such as the power of language, the importance of harmony with nature, and the perils of succumbing to darkness. By giving voice to the voiceless, Tolkien enriches his world and challenges us to think more deeply about our own. What stories might we hear if creatures around us could speak? Would they warn us, as Fafnir warned Sigurd, of the dangers of greed? Would they remind us, as Treebeard does, of the beauty and fragility of the natural world? Or would they reveal something even deeper about ourselves? Perhaps that's why these speaking creatures resonate so deeply. They remind us that every voice matters, even those we might overlook. And in the end, isn't that what makes Middle-earth and storytelling itself so enduringly magical? And yes, I know I didn't got to talk about all the amazing creatures that can talk in the Silmarillion. Maybe another time, if I find something more to say about it all. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Special thanks to all the supporters of the channel. I wouldn't be able to make this without your support. So thank you very much. If you want to know more about the creatures of Middle-earth, make sure to check out one of these videos next. Farewell till next time.